My name is Armin, one of the partners at Revology, former pricing and RGM practitioner for, I would say, bulk of my career. And my background is heavily on call it the advanced analytics, data science side of pricing and revenue management. I built dynamic pricing of systems for large retail, but I also built pricing and RGM teams in consumer products and distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And both Enrico and I, we founded our company because we believe in this idea of insourcing capabilities for clients, mostly mid-market companies, not just fancy PowerPoint decks and nice board conversations, but actually working with the frontline teams and working with the pricing and RGM teams to build lasting capabilities, frameworks, playbooks, analytics capabilities that they can own and make their companies better, right? So that's our fundamental purpose. I'll pass it on to Enrico maybe for a quick intro.
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Enrico Sieni. We haven't met yet. Similar to Armin, my passion and background is in pricing. I had the pleasure of creating and leading 3 different pricing teams at 3 different multinational companies in my past career. So I've lived the pains that many of you have seen in organizations where there's just a lot of moving parts, large organizations, a lot of silos and matrix type of companies. And so getting pricing done and helping organizations monetize on that is obviously a key mission of ours. And that's why between Revology and Revify, and we'll talk about the difference between those two later, but between the 2 companies, we are here to support organizations, make this a little bit less painful and definitely more successful.
Awesome.
So we'll see in this presentation what are some of the key pain points that we are experiencing companies going through with the tariff process. But back to you, Armin.
Great. Yeah. Let's go to slide 2. So I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, right? It's a topic that we're a little bit tired of hearing about, but the topic of tariffs it's a pain that is largely self-inflicted, right? From many different angles, it's self-inflicted, right? But it's the actual symptoms for manufacturers and distributors, especially mid-market, it's self-inflicted. And so tariffs are, again, it's a diagnostic, it's not the disease, right? The way that organization is handling the tariff shock actually reveals pricing problems that predate the tariffs, right? In many cases by years and decades. And so it's actually exposing weakness in areas of competitive visibility, pocket price architecture, its lack of customer product segmentation when it comes to understanding price sensitivities and elasticities. It's broken pricing governance, right? So it actually just turns the lights on in a room, right? Or in an office that was already messy. And so these deeper pricing problems, they actually cost far more than the tariffs themselves. And so most engagements that we run, tariff is, let's say if it's 300-400 basis points of cost pressure, sometimes more, depending on what your key raw material ingredients are. But the leakage often in a lot of those companies is much larger. And a lot of the leaders that we deal with, and this is largely an archetype versus any one company that does this really well on all 10 elements. But these 10 capabilities we're going to walk through is really what differentiates leaders that have their pricing and revenue growth management maturity at a very high level versus the laggards, right? They're actually learning very painfully what they lack while the pressure is on. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to dive deep into these 10 capabilities, and let's maybe flip to the agenda, Enrico. And so the first one we're going to talk about is just a short diagnostic, right? So why the tariff pressure is actually breaking weak price organizations, what the common responses are, blanket surcharges that we tend to see, right, which is quite dangerous. We'll talk about these capabilities, right? And we have a case illustration, and again, hypothetical, but it's largely taken from engagements we've done on Revology and Revify in the mid-market side. And then we'll talk about a maturity model where you can actually self-diagnose your organization across these 10 capabilities. And so there's a couple of things that I would just really encourage you to do is, one, most people that attend our webinars tend to be fairly opinionated on pricing. And I think those of you that are attending today are as well. So please comment. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment that you disagree with, right? If you recognize your organization in one of these elements, right, whether it's a capability that's really strong or really weak, please comment or ask questions. But hopefully the goal that we'll have and we'll hopefully achieve is you'll have a clear picture of maybe 2 to 3 kind of weakest links. That's a good starting point for you to fix it in your organizations. Okay. Great. Again, we'll talk about the diagnostic. The last time the tariffs hit, there was lots of duties on steel and autos and semiconductors and whatever else, right? We watched, oh, I don't know, maybe 8 out of 10 companies do the same thing, right? It was a blanket surcharge, right? And so it was
Yeah.
4%, 6%, 10%. It was straight across the entire book. And leaders and CFOs in companies, they felt very decisive. But as we see it on the slide, it's somewhat of a morbid description, but a butter knife is not a scalpel. So again, we'll go back to the analogy several times, but what we've learned from working with many pricing and RGM teams across mostly CPG, industrials, and
And
some kind of
distributors.
which one? And distributors for
Distributors,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and to some extent, medtech and pharma, right? The companies that actually pulled out this butter knife, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months ago, are the same companies that are now seeing volume erosion. They're certainly seeing margin erosion. A lot of them had to deal back discounts because of the price increases they gave to customers. And a lot of times, sales team had no narrative other than our cost inputs are increasing. And so it's again, it's not a tariff problem. It's a pricing maturity problem. Okay. And again, let's just stay with this analogy, right? It's the foundation for everything that we'll cover. And when you do a blanket surcharge in companies, which you've seen, again, about 8 out of 10 companies, three things happen inside your P&L simultaneously, right? And so, one, in elastic segments, so customers and products where the buyer actually has some actual alternative, right? You tend to overshoot and you have volume declines a lot of the times over the next, whatever, 2 or 3 quarters. And you don't actually see it until you see it in your P&L that you've had a dilutive margin. But you leave high single digit margin on the table, right? That the customer would have happily absorbed when you deal with inelastic segments, right? And so in the middle elasticity segments, I don't know, you land maybe flat, but it's actually the only place that blanket move works, right? And so you lose volume where you shouldn't, you leave margin where you should have captured it, and you pat yourself on the back for the piece in the middle. But actually, net what we see organizations do is you tend to lose margin and you tend to lose EBITDA about 2 to 3 quarters later. And so that's exactly what this butter knife problem tends to illustrate, where we see companies come out today. Okay. Okay, so we'll talk about the more surgical approach. And again, the gap is already here for many companies, and this is partly research, partly just based on a sample size that we're working with. But again, if you think of a mid-market industrial distributor with maybe a good Power BI stack and a very disciplined deal desk, right? They will often out execute and outperform, let's say, a Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 company that has a fancy CPQ platform and fancy pricing software and whatever else, but otherwise has very little, very weak governance wrapped around it. And we see that pattern over and over again. And a lot of CEOs, and again, this is very reminiscent to what we've seen in the data science days, right? Is we have this AI thing that's very real, right? But it's also the soup du jour of industry murmur, right? And so a lot of CFOs, or a lot of CEOs rather, not CFOs, like they want to build AI capabilities. I just want to invest in AI and maybe I can be more productive, or maybe it's going to solve all my issues, right? But it's very rarely about the tool or the platform, and it's much more about the capabilities, and it's much more about the governance, right? And so as we go through these capabilities, as you score yourself honestly across all these 10 capabilities, hopefully you'll come out with 2 or 3 things that are real gaps in your organization, and that you can actually monetize in your own environments. Okay. So here's a question that I often ask prospective clients. Imagine if the administration announces tomorrow morning that every tariff that we've had is being rolled back effective immediately. Can you actually tell me by product and by customer what was your price sensitivity? What was your pre-tariff margins? And if you could reset those prices back to the baseline, can you do it cleanly without a huge impact to your business? And no, nobody can say yes. And the issue is when you do this blanket surcharge, it gets baked into your price. It gets baked into the contract language, right? It gets baked into rebate programs and off-invoice accruals, right? And it's really embedded into your pricing architecture. And so when the tariffs roll back, right, you certainly face some bad outcomes, right? A lot of the issues that we tend to see is companies don't have a clear line item visibility to one, dead net pricing, to surcharges they've given. And so a lot of contract language doesn't allow for bilateral adjustment in both directions. And so when the tariff moves, Actually unwinding it becomes a very sort of controlled procedure in that sense. And for a lot of companies, it's a renegotiation crisis, right? And so this leads to this concept of fear-based pricing that we tend to see in companies, right? And we see this especially with like heavy kind of sales-led organizations that are dominated by commercial organizations. And it's not a right or wrong thing, but we're under pressure to assuage the sales request to give me, I don't know, 4 or 5% to actually cover the inflation. And that's actually less from sales, it comes more from finance. And so what actually happens, you over push in those elastic segments that we talked about initially, right? And you actually lose volume for the customers that had no intention of walking away, right? And you leave the margin where you should have captured it, right? And sales gets the blame, right, if for both the volume losses and the revenue shortfall. And here's one thing: most sales leaders know this is going to happen. I think most commercial organizations that we engage with, like they're not pricing scientists, but they're very in tune with their customers and their customer segments, and they have a really good sort of intuitive gut feel of how different customer segments are going to react, right? And so this elasticity informed response actually does the opposite on both ends, right? It holds the volume where customers would have walked, and it captures the margin premium where they wouldn't have, right? And I think that's the narrative that has to be built collaboratively with your sales organization. So the fear-based pricing isn't a sales execution issue a lot of the times. I know we tend to blame sales, and there's this opposing force between pricing and finance and sales, but it's actually a pricing process and call it a sort of lack of pricing insights or lack of governance. And so, again, the antidote of this is having the advanced analytics, the pricing insights, and the data that your leadership can trust, and having the analytics to essentially model out segment-based responses, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. One of the most common things that we tend to see, again, this is just a contrast of three segments, right? Is the same percentage on a weighted basis applied in different scenarios, right? But very different outcomes. So let me walk you through how you look at this chart, right? But it's probably the best illustration of the principle that we're talk about today. So the blanket, the butter knife approach is on the left side, right? You have three segments: segment A, which is highly elastic, right? And volume is going to walk, and you have certainly some margin leakage. And then you have segment B, which is medium elasticity, and the outcome is roughly flat. And then you have the segment C, which is inelastic, right? So the customer absorbs it, and we see a slight margin gain. That's when we do the uniform price increase, right? But the issue is, and most company leaders miss, we also leave, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 percentage points on the table, right, in terms of margin for segment C, right? Because it's an elastic segment. You have the product that they really need. You don't have a whole lot of competitors. You have the relationship with this company, and they value that relationship and they value the value-added services. They're inelastic, right? We could have taken a higher increase on this segment, but we decided to do a blanket surcharge, right? And so I would say, if anything, this is probably the single most important chart in the deck. It's a very common sense concept, but when we actually see it in practice for most companies, it is not executed the right way. And so most companies don't have the customer product segmentation done based on elasticities and size and margin profile or perhaps growth. And they just do this kind of uniform price increase. Okay. Maybe on this one, I think I'll just quickly talk about it. It's the same concept, right? This is just expressed perhaps differently, right? If you look at your business, whether it's customers or products, right? However, you think about the price sensitivity, right? It goes from low to very high, right? So high would be highly elastic. And you see the price increase that's being applied again from low to high on that y-axis, right? A lot of companies, what they do is they do that sort of flat horizontal line. That's the surcharge, right? And what ends up happening is you have the two sacrifices that you're making, right? You have that, we call it margin surrender, right? That's when you're under capturing the potential margin that you could have captured with inelastic segments. And you have that high volume dilution. And again, translates to margin impacts with the highly elastic segments. As opposed to doing the segment-based price increase approach, right? That essentially maximizes the potential to drive margin in your companies. And so the good news, it's all fixable, right? So the mechanics are fairly simple and the mechanics are fairly trivial. It's the way you apply it that has to come down to some other capabilities that we'll talk about, including kind of commercial coordination and pricing governance and having the right playbooks, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So again, to just recap, like tariffs they're not the disease, right? The tariff struggles are the visible symptom of a weak pricing infrastructure that we see in companies, right? And so under the surface, there's the no real segmentation and the leaky pocket price and the leaky margin and the broken governments and not understanding your clear cost to serve and not understanding your clear dead net price in a lot of the cases. And I think all this is very solvable. The issue for companies that don't address the fundamental driver, they're going to have fire drills and margin issues, operating profit issues through every volatile cycle that our economy is going through, which arguably is going to get worse and worse, right, as the global economy keeps getting more and more volatile. So again, the takeaway here is it is the symptom of a weak pricing infrastructure. So as we talk about these capabilities, which Enrico is going to lead us off, just maybe be introspective for a moment and think about like how do I compare in terms of our practices in my company when it comes to pricing and RGM analytics and governance and processes and whatever else, right? If you have a moment, also go to our website on revologyanalytics.com or myrevify.com, but you'll find the revenue growth analytics maturity scorecard. And that's an annual study that we've done each year about between 150 to 200 commercial leaders, largely pricing and RGM leaders from both large enterprises and mid-market companies. But they fill out the survey and it's all anonymized. Like we actually share the insights, no detailed company data, obviously. It's all anonymized just in terms of learnings. But take that scorecard when you get a chance and it'll score you in your pricing and RGM analytics maturity capabilities. And I'll give you some somewhat pointed recommendations on what you should think about improving to get to the best in class. Okay. So I'll turn it over to Enrico, who's going to talk about the key capabilities that we need to kind of turn this tariff problem around.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Armin. Yeah, we've been teaching you about the 10 capabilities, so we'll go through them one by one. I'll cover the first six, and then Armin will cover the remainder and also talk about the overall system view that we have, putting it all together. But the 10 capabilities that we will cover today in detail, the speed of response, clarity and granularity, price realization, customer transparency, strategic segmentation, cross-functional alignment, scenario planning, product and portfolio strategy, commercial discipline, and continuous monitoring. What we've seen is companies that really do a great job at navigating any major shift in the economy or the industry, tariffs impact being one of them, really do well across these 10. There's very few, if hardly any companies that are leaders in across all 10, but through the presentation, there are some of these that are really key success criteria that companies must have while they work on some of the other 10 in order to be successful. We'll take you through each of these one by one. So the speed of change and the speed of response, if you look at laggards, typically we see that their response time is over 90 days. They're still analyzing exposure after the announcement, while the sales are off negotiating one-off exemption deals to stall for time, while they're trying to figure out what is the management response. And so they're basically creating in the vacuum the storyline while they wait for some broader air support. Leaders on the other side are under 30 days typically. They're repricing almost instantly using pre-built tariff corridors and have a dynamic execution process which is already in place. We saw a food ingredients company that shifted from annual to quarterly pricing, and that change in rhythm helped them expand margin by 100 basis points during severe cost shocks. So even looking at the overall timeline of price increases, bringing a level of agility that helps out. And what is that leaders are typically over 3 times more likely to raise prices without losing volume. And so speed is not just about haste, it's about having the infrastructure so that when you do make the move, it's actually surgical and it's not rushed and not a panic type of price change. Capability number 2 is around clarity and granularity. Laggards rely on average margin thinking, so 30% blended looks fine from the top level, but as blended averages hide the bleeding at the transactional level. Some accounts may be well above 30, some accounts may be under 5, and some even may be a negative margin. The aggregate illusion really masks what's going on behind the scene and really makes it difficult to take surgical action. Instead, leaders know precise cost to serve down to the SKU level and customer segment. They can isolate the 5% margin accounts, the bleeders, instantly. And the proof point is striking. 63% of companies cannot accurately measure promotional ROI on the true net margin. And so what happens is that you end up taking decisions basically on instinct instead of data. Capability 3 is around price realization. So this is about the gap between list price and what actually lands in the P&L, the pocket price. Laggards have typically 20+% margin leakage. They have unmanaged rebates, they have freight waivers, off-invoice allowances, returns. So you may start with a $10,000 order, but by the time you have all these leakage points, you may have a 44% hit to the expected profit. And that's over $1,000 quietly given away as you start adding all these different layers in the sales process. Conversely, leaders have a very tight pocket price control, very often under 2% of leakage. And so if you look at the global lighting supplier that fixed their off-invoice leakage, they drove a 51% operating profit increase in a single year. Same volume, same customer, they just plugged the leaks. And so the intent here is you want to be really predictive and planned as to where you make those concessions and typically get something in return from the customer instead of selling and letting your sales team loose, selling on volume and basically giving away all that margin very often unnecessarily. Capability number 4 is around customer transparency. And so here, the laggard is what I call the apologetic surprise, right? They send out a rushed generic letter that is sent at the last minute, and attached to it is an unexpectedly high invoice that the customer immediately has a knee-jerk reaction to. So the customer feels ambushed, the sales team feels defensive because all of a sudden they're on the hook and they got an angry customer on the phone. And guess what? The price increase very often gets pushed back because it's really difficult to defend in that type of situation. On the flip side, leaders do proactive justification, right? So they have pre-built communication templates, they have dual billing transparency, fully documented cost pass-through logic. And you have a couple of examples that we witnessed. One was a specialty coating, and basically they could actually prove 50,000 pounds a day saved by faster cure times, and being able to remind the customer to say, hey, look, we have tariff. I apologize. Unfortunately, it's outside of our control. There's nothing we can do about it. But let's remind you how much money we're saving you through the service and the process that we are creating for you, right? So be able to move away from the problem to say, hey, this is a problem that is affecting both of us. Let's keep on working on ways to make your business more successful in spite of this challenge that is hurting both of us. And so it becomes a very different narrative and story. Another story is around a cloud provider that used dual billing transparency and helping the customer optimize their own cost. And while doing that, being able to still grow revenue 15%. And the key point here is that transparency isn't necessarily a weakness. It should be part of the strategy and how you win when you have to navigate these tough conversations and situations. Capability number 5 is around strategic segmentation. Laggards do the peanut butter spread approach. So as Armin was saying, you know that you have an impact of X amount of dollars. You say across the business that equates to an 8% price increase, and they're going to go flat out 8% across the board. But that's a blindly approach to your price increase. Leaders use, as Armin was mentioning, elasticity-driven corridors. So they actually have differentiated price action by empirical elasticity and the strategic value of the product and the customer. And so we've seen, for example, a wireless headphone company where they used the pooled elasticity that matched the truth. And what they realized is that they had a segment that could only afford a -8% entry point, Another customer had instead leverage to be able to have a 5% premium compared to where they were. And as a result, they were actually able to drive revenue up instead of taking overall loss and losing customers. Customers that do this smartly can have great outcomes, still having exactly the same customers as before and the same SKU that they were selling. But the fact that you can realize that you have very radical different elasticity by segment, you can actually drive potential favorable outcomes. Very different story between two scenarios. And then on the capability number 6, the cross-functional alignment, this is a key one that I see across organizations. And in my experience, having created and led pricing teams from scratch, this is a key foundational items that a lot of companies get wrong because everyone is operating in their own silos and therefore not collaborating together. It's frankly one of the hardest capability to build. In laggard organizations, pricing operates in a vacuum. So sales literally finds out about the price increase when the new invoice is generated. And then finance, supply chain, and sales are all looking at different versions of the same number based on how they're slicing the reality of that tariff increase and how it's going to impact their department by itself. Instead, leaders are much more proactive. They run what we call a weekly war room. We installed a few of those at customers of ours. Other companies call it a huddle. They call it a weekly recap, a profitability touch base, or a pricing review. However you want to call it, the key thing is making sure that you have all the key stakeholders in the room. Very often it's the leaders of organizations that are bringing together the table, but it needs to be a weekly cadence. It can be a short tactical execution focused meeting. But when you see this working well, as in the example of the global industrial company, they established this war room and they retrained hundreds of reps in 2 weeks. And the price increase acceptance rates and total volumes actually increased. And so it's really impossible to get to this level of performance unless you have this organizational alignment piece in place within companies. Yeah. Let me pass it back to Armin. Armin, you want to go through the remaining capabilities?
Yeah, let me try to go a little bit faster, but just the last point, right, is I would say it's probably the most important point. Like most things just comes down to people and processes, right? And so we have that conversation as about, I would say, maybe 75% of our engagements, at least on the Revology side, are heavy. They have a heavy kind of AI ML component to that. And I think there's still this prevalent thought process of technology can solve stuff and all that stuff. No, it's really comes down to people and processes, and that's never going to change. It's going to persist even in the age of AI. So let's talk about capability 7, which is again another kind of foundational kind of 101 thing of scenario planning, right? And so the leader, they have several scenarios, right? They have several distinct scenarios that they've modeled in advance, and each one is mapped to a playbook that's ready to execute. So when you actually have a tariff volatility that hits, they don't ask, oh crap, what do we do? Instead, they're like, okay, which scenario is this? And they're going to pull the corresponding playbook to address that and to plan and strategize and then implement that with their operational teams, right? They build their financial impact in advance as part of these scenario models, whereas the laggard, they're going to haphazardly run and it's a fire drill and they're going to build it the morning after the tariff gets announced, right, or the week after. And by, I don't know, a month later, they have a really good scenario model, but it's already outdated, right? Because we may have had some additional tariff changes. And down the line, it has a huge financial impact. And we've actually seen, it was a B2B distributor, about a 30% gross margin. They had a really good understanding of what is the price increase that we need to do based on our playbook. And at that increase, what is our break-even volume loss? Oh, we can actually afford a 40% volume loss and still break even on our margin. Like they understood that math, right? And so they understood that some percentage of your volume can walk away and you're still making money at the new price and the new margin that you've enacted because of cost inflation, right? Versus a lot of the laggards in the industry, they're still having a tough time sort of understanding this concept of break-even volume and break-even elasticities and things like that, right? So what is my volume loss tolerance at every price point that I'm increasing, right? And so once you have these playbooks and once you have these scenario planning capabilities, the conversation with sales and finance is just a lot more straightforward, right? You're not negotiating a number, right? You're discussing facts. The next one is about product and portfolio strategy, right? And so they, meaning the leaders, right? So the kind of the leader archetype companies, they actually use a lot of the times this crazy cost pressure as an occasion to rationalize the skew tail and shift towards higher margin lines, right? And that's important because the tariffs actually become this forcing function, right, for to just have a better portfolio hygiene, which anyways happened a long time ago. But the laggards, right, they defend every skew uniformly, right? So they protect the tail items even if they've been losing money for years, especially when you factor in the cost to serve to different customers. And they don't want to let go of it because that's what the customer asks for, even if it's just a handful of customers. And so they end up with bloated portfolios and a margin profile that's systematically much worse than it should be. A manufacturing client, and actually instead of raising the prices everywhere, they're lengthened the lead times, right? They had custom products that they manufactured, but they actually lengthened the lead times on their customer products and they kept the stock on some of these fast, higher margin standard lines in full capacity, right? And so one that ended up happening is customers who they really needed and valued the custom configuration, they pay for it with longer lead times, right? And actually pay for it with a price that reflected the cost to serve adjusted gross margin. And customers who didn't want to wait, right, they migrated to the standard portfolio, and that happened to be much higher margin, right? And so the mix shift actually delivered a margin improvement that was far better than the price increase could have done, especially when you factor in the cost inflation element. And so this is your kind of standard price, cost, volume mix capability, where often proper mix management is a equally good, if not better, mitigant to the inflationary pressure that you see in organizations. Okay. Now, commercial discipline, it's another obvious one, right? But you have to have commercial discipline along with the cross-functional collaboration. And the leaders, right, they give their sales teams and sales reps a clean, call it a clean zone to operate in, right? And they actually enforce the discounting boundaries of processes and approval authority, and certainly the right incentives, right, which is another thing to emphasize. You have to have the right incentives that lead to the right behaviors. The laggards don't have that, right? There's heavy discounting to close deals at quarter end, right? There's no systematic approval chain, or there's an approval chain, right? Discounts always end up settling at whatever the next authority level is, right? So if the sales manager or the sales director or have the direct relationship or the direct reporting relationship was a 25%, 30%, whatever discount authority. When we look at the actual discount curves, guess what? 50% of the volume ends up at 25, 30% discounts. And so that the delta is actually quite meaningful. The other piece is just governance and this idea of eliminating these uncontrolled sales discretions, right? And that's a huge EBIT impact when you actually drop it through the P&L, right? And so a good discounting, or whether it's deal desk, a good design is not taking away the authority from sales, right? It's about giving them a defensible zone and certainly giving them air cover when it needs some kind of a leadership approval, but there needs to be clarity on where the guardrails are, why the guardrails are such, and what the analysis was that actually formulated those guardrails. And once you have that discussion with the sales team and you explain it in a manner that resonates with them, they'll be on board, right? But reps that have well-run deal desks and run justified discounting structures, they close faster, right? There's less internal friction and it's a much smoother operation. Now, the next capability is continuous monitoring. Again, another kind of very kind of common sense thing. But I just want to be clear, like we don't need real-time data for this, right? I know this whole terminology of real-time monitoring and real-time data analysis, especially in B2B, you don't need it. Like weekly is fine, right? In some instances, like even monthly will suffice, right? But you just need some weekly updated dashboards that actually tracks net price realization. It tracks, are you keeping up and are you mitigating your cost inflation with pricing actions? Oh, and by the way, pricing actions is not just about your list price, but also trade and different allowances, tracking competitive pricing and share. And so that all needs to be part of your weekly rhythm that gets reviewed, and key insights or key exceptions are being served out to the sales team as part of kind of a sales enablement foundation as well. But what we see the laggards do is they have these monthly P&L reviews, and even the P&L reviews just to have this integrated analysis put together with detailed customer profitability metrics. That's just like an arduous effort, right? There's an entire small team working on that for a couple of weeks at a time. And so by the time they actually see the margin decline, right, it's already data that's like a month old, right? And 2 to 3 months of margin are just gone before any adjustment can happen, right? And so again, I just want to emphasize the gap between the leaders and laggards when it comes to this continuous monitoring, right? It isn't AI, right? It's the frequency and the feedback loop on the key pricing insights and the KPIs. And you can do that without AI. You can also do that without advanced analytics. And as much as it pains me to admit that as an AI, advanced analytics first, pricing and RGM person, that's just the reality. And again, like I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Your classic kind of pocket margin waterfall view of an organization, right? But the only takeaway is the different leakages that you see at different stages or different valves, whatever analogy you want to use, right? They correspond to these capabilities, right? And things like weak segmentation that we talked about, right? What does that create? It actually creates these unmanaged discounting exceptions that influence price realization, right? Weak cross-functional alignment that Enrico talked about, right? It also creates these unchecked discounting in the middle and maybe elastic volume loss on kind of on the bottom, right? And so they're not independent, right? There's a chain and they create this vicious cycle where if you lack on any one of these capabilities, it will show up in your actual pocket margin waterfall going from your list price to your invoice price all the way down to your margin. Okay. I'll go through this section because I'm going to give more time for Enrico to talk about the maturity model of what you need to build. But maybe we can go to the example, Enrico, on the next slide. So again, hypothetical examples, but we have two companies. Maybe do you mind showing the actual side-by-side comparison on the next slide? So let me just frame it. These are kind of archetypes. These are not real numbers, but we've taken it from an amalgamation of engagements that we've had with industrial companies. Same tariff event, very different outcomes, right? So company A is the laggard in this case. It's pretend that it's an electrical wire manufacturer. It's about 300 million in revenue, regional footprint. Lots of B2B contracts, right? No tariff pass-through clauses or bilateral adjustment clauses. And so what do they have? They had copper and aluminum tariffs, right? They spiked in one of the quarters and profitability just eroded. And their response is exactly what, again, 80% of the companies do is a blanket 20% surcharge across the board, right? No scenario modeling, no price elasticity modeling, no segmentation. And so a lot of improvisation in the field, right? A lot of the sales guys, they expanded the discounts to hold the volume, especially at the end of the quarter. And so they didn't mitigate, right, the cost inflation, right? And so when you look at company A versus company B, if you look at maybe the next slide when we look at the
results, yep.
the impact on the P&L, right? 12 months later, right, here's where they ended up, right? Again, company B had this very surgical scalpel-based approach, right, where they actually segmented the customers and they did segment-based price increases. And there was a sharp difference, right, in the actual gross margin impact. There was a sharp difference in customer relationships as measured by NPS and also in the EBITDA numbers. So again, when you look at the trends over time, right, these are not like one-time events that these capabilities or like thereof create. These are compounding effects, right? And so what ends up happening, if you can show the next slide, Enrico, just shows
Yeah,
a
I got a
margin.
question coming, Armin, from the audience. They're asking, hey, have you seen companies where not necessarily everything is red or everything is green? Like in this example, have you seen situations where there's more of a mixed picture? There is one negative minus 1.2 in volume, but
Oh, yeah, for sure. Not everything is going to be negative, right? There's going to be plenty of situations where, and we've seen this outside of tariffs as well, right? Like we see it when, let's say you want to do a price increase on a premium line on your product, right? Or you want to premiumize one of your product lines, you're going to sell it at a higher price because that's what your internal research showed. You deploy it in the market and you just end up discounting and you end up trading back the profits. So your gross revenue increases, but your net revenue actually declines and your margin actually declines. We've also seen instances where, and we see this in distribution quite a bit, depending on the incentive levels, and you give these deep discounts or volume deals and quantity deals, and you're getting the volume gains, so your volume is up substantially, but
not enough.
but just not enough. Given your margin profile, especially a distribution
Yeah.
company that has a low double-digit margins, you just end up losing EBITDA quite a bit, right? And so we see it all the time where one of the levers or two of the levers is up, but the levers that actually matter for your net income, for your valuation, it's actually down, right? And that's exactly what we see with these two different archetypes, right? Where you actually see the effects being compounded, right? And so you look at over time, this, erosion in EBITDA and erosion in profitability for company A sort of it gets compounded in subsequent months, right? Because you don't have the capabilities to address the defect in customers and the volume loss and the margin loss, et cetera, versus the company that is doing this very surgically, right? They actually start to increase their performance over time because it is a compounding effect, right? Okay. And again, just high level, this goes back to some of the research that's been done on companies that have these two different types of capabilities, right? The leader versus laggard difference or spread in EBITDA, right? It sits between, I don't know, three to 700 basis points, depending on the sector, right? And so, again, it depends on industry, but especially industrial distribution and specialty manufacturing are at the wider end of that range. And across most of our engagements, when elasticity or price sensitivity is actually properly modeled by product family and by customer segment, it's actually built into your pricing architecture. You consistently tend to outperform those companies that don't have these capabilities and are doing these blanket price increases, right? And again, the only takeaway here is we tend to see these differences in financial performance for companies that have a lower versus higher maturity. When we looked at our survey results from the Revenue Growth Analytics Maturity Scorecard, we also tend to see the same thing. So public companies that have completed our survey, and we looked at their maturity scores relative to their financial performance, over time, there's a clear relationship between pricing and RGM analytics maturity and how you're performing. And again, it's not AI, it's people, it's processes, and it's call it pricing KPIs and the regular monitoring of those pricing KPIs. Okay, so I'm done with the kind of the contrast between the two companies. I'll pass it back to Enrico to walk us through the maturity model, and you can maybe evaluate your own companies against the maturity grid.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we prepared a workbook or cheat sheet for you to use to be able to evaluate your organization. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put it in the chat. But basically, as you can see here, these are the 10 capabilities that we've covered so far. And you'll see the 3 columns to basically evaluate whether you think your company is a laggard or it's a mainstream or a leader in those capabilities. The recommendation that we give to our clients is don't aim to be the leader everywhere in this matrix. Most organizations can't and honestly shouldn't. Your goal is to honestly identify the 2 or 3 rows where you're currently in the laggard column, because those will typically be your highest leverage fixes. So focus there. And if you have a heroic team member in one area that makes you think that the capability you have is mature, if you're just depending on one person in your organization, realistically, that's not really a capability, right? That could be lost very easily. So it needs to be something that is sustainable over time in order to really be leader capability. On the maturity point, Armin gave you plenty of examples of organizations that are winning and making more money and thriving even in spite of this. So I won't take you through all the numbers, but there's a lot of research beyond what we've done internally ourselves that basically demonstrate that companies that have these capabilities definitely outperform laggards or people that are struggling to build those capabilities. Again, one key reason to work on these capabilities for sure. So let's talk about where to start. So we believe there's 2 key priorities that you should be working on immediately. The first is what we call exposure visibility. So this is about rebuilding a SKU by customer, by tariff view of margin. Isolate what's really exposed and really start focusing on your top 10 bleeding accounts first, right? So once you start understanding your pocket price waterfall end to end, and you start killing that blended gross margin that, as we mentioned before, is a killer in organization, replace it instead with segment level views. And all of a sudden, your numbers are not going to show an overall bleeding. It's actually showing you something much more surgical that you can take action on. And then the next priority is on customer profitability. So once you start understanding beyond the invoice your cost to serve by customer segment, not by size, but by customer segment, Now you start looking at more details around those segments in terms of elasticity, differentiated playbooks based on elasticity and loyalty, for example, price floors that are tied to margin, not to list discount. And so if you can implement these two priorities within the first 90 days, everything else really becomes easier, including also selling to your leadership team and your organization, working on the next 8 capabilities or pricing steps that you have in your arsenal to go after an attack. So let's talk about the 5 key takeaways and 2 ways to engage if you need help. So the first is really looking at the 90-day transformation, right? As we mentioned before, tariffs are not going to wait for you, and they're not going to wait for your pricing infrastructure to mature. And so here's an easy to follow one pager to say, in the next 90 days, what are you going to start working on in order to first stop the bleeding? Number 2, deploy capabilities, which is around clarity and granularity. And then number 3, activate the scalpel, as Armin mentioned, so that you can actually start getting more surgical. And so this is just a one-pager to just illustrate which capabilities to go after, what to focus on first. Again, we'll send the material and the recording so that you have this for reference. The sad reality is that every day that you spend in analysis paralysis is a day of unrecoverable margin loss, right? You won't be able to go back to your customers asking for that money back. And yes, we don't agree with butter knife approach and the 10% blunt price increase. That's dangerous, but so is also sitting on the sidelines working on a plan. So the key tenets that we would like to leave you today with, first of all, tariffs are a symptom, right? As you've probably seen, the blanket surcharges and the fear of base price pricing really exposes companies that have weak pricing, and it's a wake-up call that people should be taken seriously. Blanket surcharges, of course, is just a trap. So is fear-based pricing, right? And the quicker you can move away from average pricing and average margin, the better you can start taking more surgical actions. And then lastly, as Armin mentioned, everyone right nowadays is running towards AI and thinking that if they buy a system that has AI, the problems will be solved. The sad reality, as we covered in the previous webinar that we did, is not necessarily accurate, right? There's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done and a lot of more nuance on how you use AI in order to get results that truly matter and are sustainable over time. So last quick information, if you need help, there's 2 ways you can reach us. As Armin mentioned, we have 2 organizations with a lot of talent at our disposal that do phenomenal work. On the Revology Analytics side, we have people that are committed to deep engagement. Call this the white glove service for large organizations that really require more hands-on and a custom understanding and view of initiatives that will transform how the organization approaches on pricing. Conversely, on the Revify Analytics, we have a nimble team that really works on immediate activation and really going after the diagnostic and executing the low-hanging fruit for organizations that either are not ready to do the Revology Analytics type of size engagement, or they want to first get a lay of the land and understand how much potential there is out there that could be reaped through pricing and better commercial practices to then create funding and organize the pricing initiatives from there. We'll leave you that. Feel free to reach out to Armin or myself directly, or go to these websites if you'd like to get some more information.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Enrico. And guys, thank you so much for joining. We did have a couple of questions. We'll just address that in the follow-up email that we send.
Yeah.
Along with the recording. And again, feel free to reach out to us anytime. If you get a chance, take the Revenue Growth Analytics Maturity Scorecard on our website, just so you can measure yourself against best practice when it came to analytics and process and strategy capabilities. And hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. And we'll keep in touch. We'll chat next month.
Thank you. Yeah, feel free to reach out to us if you have comments on these webinars, or if you have ideas or things that you would like to hear on webinars going forward. Please reach out to us on LinkedIn or by email, and we'll be glad to line those up for future events.
Awesome. Great to see everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys.
everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.